Cherokee removal, named the Trail of Tears by the Native Americans that were forced through this horrid movement to the West, is just as important today as it was when it was occurring. A modern, educated analysis of this historical event proves to demonstrate how certain dynamics, social conditions, and processes can lead to violently unfortunate outcomes. Quote, after considering the different perspectives of the cultures involved, it is important to prevent similar tragedies from being repeated, end quote. This short film offers an educated analysis acknowledging a variety of disciplines within the social sciences, along with a description of the lives of the Cherokee before the arrival of white men, how their lives changed once they met, how they fought to hold on to the lands that were promised but ultimately taken, and how thousands of lives were lost as a direct result of the removal processes. The Cherokee, even during the 1500s, were quite the civilized people. Many have referred to the Cherokee people as being even more civilized than the white men that claimed them to be savage. They called themselves Ani-Yun-Wea, which translates into the principal people. Stanley, Night of the Cruel Moon, and Katie Marsico's The Trail of Tears, the tragedy of the American Indians. Their societies consisted of farmers, gatherers, and hunters. They sustained themselves and their families with a variety of crops, including beans, corn, and squash, and hunted woodland animals such as deer, foxes, elks, rabbits, and bears. They raised their families in pole and thatch huts located along rivers and lakes. Their governing entities consisted of various chiefs, priests, priestesses, counselors, and warriors of two branches, the red government, which maintained power in times of war, and the white government, which maintained power in times of peace. They were happily successful in their independent ways, but had also developed extensive relations with many indigenous peoples, including the Creek Indians. Although they have a history engaging in war, according to Hoy, with the Shawnee and Muskogee for purposes of protecting their land, they are generally a nonviolent and peaceful people known for their outstanding ability to treat everyone equally, and for their welcoming and forgiving ability to accept and adhere to the ways of other cultures. The Cherokee were first introduced to white men during the mid-1500s when they came upon an army searching for gold. Their relations with this army, led by a fiercely strong-armed, ambitious Spanish explorer with a mission to take everything that is valuable back to Europe, Hernando de Soto, were more than just amicable. The Cherokee people believed in giving gifts as an offer of peace, and receiving this gift is taken as a sign of alliance. During their first meeting, the Cherokee gave the Spanish army enough food and other supplies that it has been said to have replenished his expedition, and so the relationship was built on friendly terms and continued as so. Soon the Spanish army concluded there were no gold to be found on the land, and they engaged in trading with the Cherokee to obtain food for nourishment, as well as skins and furs for protection and efficient storage before deciding to move west. This practice continued and later included trade with the English. After their arrival during the early 1600s, which proved to be the first signs of the European influence on the Cherokee. Influenced by the requests of an Englishman, the Cherokee changed from a governmental system of independent town chiefs to that of a single, dominant tribal chief, which greatly aided the British in working out trade agreements and treaties. The meetings with the settling English were not always peaceful. Some of the English, upon their arrival, had previously encountered and engaged in hostile relations with other Native American tribes, so when the time came to greet the Cherokee, the white men were nervously on edge and steadily prepared to violently protect themselves and their interests against anyone of an Indian affiliation. Of course, their interests were not only of sustenance but also of prosperity, and most of the settlers had a strong interest in the land, so they began entering into treaties that almost always consisted of terms forcing the Cherokee to give up more of their land. Quote, in an effort to hold on to the southeastern territories that had served as everything from hunting grounds to burial plots for their ancestors, the Cherokee even resorted to offering themselves up as allies to the whites during times of warfare. The tribe aided the colonists from 1711 to 1713 as the Allies struggled to defeat their common foe, the Tuscarora, and again sided with British American forces during the French and Indian War, which lasted from 1754 to 1763. Treaty after treaty, they were promised it was the last they would endure, and that no more land would be taken from them, and treaty after treaty, the Cherokee find they were lied to. From 1785 to 1902, the Cherokee signed 25 treaties and provided support during warfare with white men. 18 of these gave up tribal lands. These deceptions, along with the annihilation of 3 tribal leaders in a situation where they were promised U.S. protection, led to a frustrated and angry Cherokee people, and ultimately to, quote, Indian raids on colonial settlements and white retaliation that came in the form of settlers ransacking Cherokee villages, end quote. The Cherokee were not only losing land, they were losing their way of life, as well as their lives. The introduction of the white man also meant the introduction of many diseases, including but not limited to tuberculosis, cholera, measles, mumps, small and chickenpox, pneumonia, and influenza, and were responsible for, over the centuries, taking the lives of almost half of the Cherokee population. Many Europeans developed intimate relationships with the Cherokee, and a race of mixed bloods were formed. These mixed bloods were especially fond of the idea of adhering to the ways of the white man, while the traditional or more full-blooded Cherokees held on to their patriotic right of independence from the white man and their ways. This created an important historical divide within the Cherokee people. Christianity was immediately introduced to the Cherokee. It was white men's full intention to thrust their religion and all of their ways onto the natives. Quote, missionaries in the late 1790s began arriving as well, armed with the religious values and domestic tools for remaking Native Americans. Beginning in 1799, evangelical Protestants, Moravians, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians fanned out into Indian country, setting up schools and mission where Indian boys were taught to become farmers and artisans, and Indian girls learned to sew, weave, and cook. End quote. Desperate, quote, the Cherokee fought with the British during part of the American Revolution in exchange for the Europeans' assurance that they would in turn keep the colonists from further encroaching upon tribal lands, end quote. However, they ultimately, quote, lost nearly 10,000 additional square miles of territory by the time the conflict ended, end quote, proving to be once again another empty promise. By the 1800s, America was filled with prospecting settlers eager to farm the land and build their missionaries, schools, and businesses, and many more eager to mine gold. Quote, more than 5 million citizens claiming the United States as their home in 1800, end quote. With the pressure to rebuild the destruction caused by the wars, and a further attempt to assimilate the few remaining challenging Cherokee into the ways of the white man, under first President George Washington's administration, in an attempt for peace with the natives, the U.S. Secretary of War Henry Knox was forced to devise policies, quote, that would allow for American expansion, but that would simultaneously treat tribes such as the Cherokee as independent nations worthy of respect, end quote. According to Daniel Blake Smith, author of An American Betrayal and co-author of The Shipwreck That Saved Jamestown, Henry Knox stated, quote, the Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right to soil. It cannot be taken from them unless by their free consent. To dispossess them would be a gross violation of the fundamental laws of nature and of that justice which is the glory of a nation. End quote. Shortly after, natives in Georgia were no longer allowed to title land and were to be removed according to the Georgia Compact of 1802. By 1812, approximately 25% of the Cherokee had voluntarily moved to the west, and the remaining Cherokees were once again supporting whites in warfare during the Creek War, where the Cherokee fought both for, mostly full-bloods, and against, mostly mixed-bloods, the Creeks, and afterwards, all the Cherokee gave up even more of their lands to the settlers of a nation that had recently almost doubled its territory. According to Smith and Williams, Andrew Jackson fought in this war alongside mixed-blood John Ross, future chief leader of the Cherokee people, and during their surveying came upon a dying orphan native child which he soon adopted and sent home, only to be treated as something of a novelty and pet, hid from society except for occasions where he, Lincoya, would be made to dress up and chant for guests until he later died in 1828 from a lung infection. In 1828, shortly after the election of Chief John Ross and the discovery of gold in Georgia, Andrew Jackson was elected as the 7th President of the United States. Even though he fought beside the Cherokee and had adopted and cared for a native child, he was an antagonist to the Cherokee cause. He held on to the belief that Indians were savages and that they were a nuisance to the white people and their ways. He claimed his decision came from his belief that it was in the best interest of the native people that they migrate west to the Indian Territory, so that they will no longer be bothered by the ways of the white man. According to Gene Williams, in Trails of Tears, American Indians driven from their lands, Jackson stated, quote, "It will be my sincere and constant desire to observe towards the Indian tribes within our limits a just and liberal policy, and to give that humane and considerate attention to their rights and their wants, which are consistent with the habits of our government and the feelings of our people." End quote. By this time, the old nation Cherokee had formed a government like that of the U.S. government and had established a printing press in their declared capital, New Echota, Georgia, that printed using both the English and Cherokee alphabet invented by Sequoyah, or George Guest, which proved to be very intimidating to the land and money-hungry economic and political leaders of Georgia. Needing the backing of these Georgian leaders, Jackson supported Georgia when they put the Cherokee under state law, where Cherokee were arrested and jailed on the slightest excuses. Whites who committed crimes against the Indians were not punished, and in every way possible the Cherokee were prosecuted in an effort to make them give up their land. Quote, "They were even forbidden to mine gold on their own property." End quote. Elias Boudinot, nephew of Major Ridge and married to, quote, "a cultured white girl of good family," end quote, printed in the Cherokee Phoenix that if the United States did not protect the Cherokee from Georgia, the tribe could have, quote, "no confidence left in the United States, will be more just and faithful toward us in the barren prairies of the West than here on the soil inherited from the great author of our existence," end quote. Jackson fostered the Indian Removal Act that passed Congress in 1830 and the forced removal of thousands of Cherokee, determined to be required by the controversial treaty that accelerated the divide amongst the Cherokee people. The Treaty of New Echota, signed in 1835, began in 1838. The Treaty of New Echota, signed by Major Ridge, Boudinot, and only a few other Cherokee, behind John Ross's back, gave up all their remaining Cherokee land to the U.S. and stipulated that their removal to the Indian Territory be commenced no longer than 2 years from that day. Quote, "The treaty transferred all tribal lands east of Mississippi River to the United States government in exchange for $5 million, end quote. This infuriated most of the Cherokee people, and thoughts of retaliation were abound. A few of the Cherokee, including Ridge and Boudinot, left for the Indian Territory soon after signing, but most stayed behind in hope that John Ross would be able to come through and save their homeland from being taken from them. They continued as usual, making no plans to sell off their belongings to get ready for the journey that lay ahead. Quote, "They had nothing to ready themselves for the move, and Scott blamed Ross for this. Most Cherokees went about their business as if there were no shadow over their land. Many were actively planting gardens for their summer crop." End quote. By 1838, General Winfield Scott had put together an army of more than 7,000 men to prepare for the forced removal. By May 10, 1838, quote, "Scott issued a proclamation to the Cherokee people. He directed the Cherokee people to prepare for immigration and come forward so they could be transported to their new homes. Forcible military collection of the Cherokee began on May 26. End quote. According to many literature and many journal entries, the troops did not allow time to collect personal items, nor were the officials kind-hearted or friendly. Prepared for the Cherokee to run in every direction, they stormed in and ruthlessly gathered the Cherokee. The Cherokee watched as their white neighbors immediately came running into their homes, robbing them of all their property they were forced to leave behind. Many written accounts of this gathering is described as if the people were being herded as cows. Morsico shares a journal entry of a young American Indian boy named Samuel Cloud that endured this horrid event, and he describes the gathering of his people as, quote, "They led us to a stockade. They herd us into the pen like we are cattle," end quote. Hoyt, in his book, shares the experiences told by Reverend Daniel Butrick, and he also described the gathering of the Cherokee people as herding cattle. Quote, "They witnessed a like number who had only recently been driven across the deep Chickamauga River, virtually like a herd of cattle," end quote. Once again, but certainly not the last example, Williams, in her book, states that, quote, "The Cherokee were herded along like cattle with shouts and whoops," end quote. Quote, "Some soldiers and officers were rough and brutal, striking their prisoners or prodding them with bayonets," end quote. The stockades, or detention camps, were not built with human occupancy in mind. They were built with intentions of using the least and cheapest material possible. They were hardly suitable for animals. Quote, for weeks the bewildered mass of Indians remained crammed into the mosquito-ridden stockades without bedding, cooking utensils, extra clothing, or adequate sanitation facilities. End quote. It is mentioned in many sources that approximately 500 Cherokees lost their lives in these camps. Those in charge of purchasing supplies would buy cheaper products and smaller rations for purposes of saving money to put in their own pockets. Those that were selling the supplies were stooping the weights and measures in their own favor. Mistreatment of the Cherokee by the officers in charge was a regular occurrence. The men would purposely seek out the women and girls, and their cries could be heard from outside their tents, but none of the Cherokee felt there were anything they could do about it. They were outnumbered and overpowered. They were in despair. They felt as if this was the end of the line, the last of their fight. Many of the Cherokee became sick from malnutrition, poor sanitation practices, diseases, before the journey even began. When Ross heard what conditions the Cherokee were being held in and the treatment they faced from the officers, he pled with Scott to allow him to take charge, to lead them to the Indian Territory, and to release the duties of the officers. Scott agreed and allowed him approximately $65 per person for this year-long, horrendously ill-prepared journey. The Cherokee were divided up into groups according to their choice of following. Most were pro-Ross, and so most were led by his administration. The pro-treaty party were led by officers as well as assigned conductors of the pro-treaty Cherokee leaders. They took numerous routes, and out of the hard-headedness of the dispute between Ross and Ridge, they left at different times. They faced tremendous fights with nature, including monsoons in the fall and spring, drought in the summer, and snow and ice in the winter. There are many recorded accounts where the Cherokee complained of having only the clothes they left in and nothing to change into for the whole duration of the journey. Also, many Cherokee victims, as well as white witnesses, claimed they weren't given any or didn't have any, quote, covering for the feet except what nature had given them, end quote. They were given, quote, foul drinking water, end quote, and spoiled meat. More than one of the routes required crossing a river, and this proved to be an extreme setback for the pro-Ross party because they did not have access to a ferry, as did the pro-treaty party, that eventually overloaded a ferry to, quote, double its safe load. It sank and almost 100 people drowned, end quote. During this journey, President Van Buren told the Senate that they had migrated, quote, without apparent reluctance, end quote, and with, quote, happy effect, end quote. During this same period, it was being reported by an ethnologist that one of the officers leading the pro-treaty party said, quote, I have fought through the Civil War, and I have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew, end quote. While exact statistics do not exist because of the lack of recorders and destroyed records, it is estimated that approximately 4,000 Cherokees lost their lives during the Trail of Tears. By spring of 1838, all the Cherokee, except for the few hundred that managed to evade capture and hid in the mountains of North Carolina, were getting settled in the Indian Territory. Only later to have even more of their promised lands taken from them for white man's purposes, and again they sacrificed their lives in support of white man's warfare, only to engage in more treaties that led to more broken promises. Even with their lasting struggle with white man's broken promises and selfish retaliations, today, the Cherokee have replenished their population, regained their independence, reestablished their government, and are once again very prosperous. The Cherokee removal was undoubtedly a cruel and merciless process of decolonization. Frantz Fanon, an intelligent psychiatrist and Marxist humanist, concerned himself with the violent and nonviolent social and psychological relations of colonialism. In his work, Concerning Violence, published in his book The Wretched of the Earth, he declares that, quote, decolonization is always a violent phenomenon, end quote. He describes the colonial world as being divided into distinct sections and emphasizes how the controversial lines separating the sections are revealed. Fannin states that, quote, its geographical layout will allow us to mark out the lines on which a decolonized society will be reorganized, end quote. Upon initial meetings, the lines were clearly revealed. The Cherokee were the native and the white man the settler. Many white men were not first introduced to the civilized ways of the Cherokee, but were introduced to the primitive and sometimes violent ways of other Native American tribes, and with their arrogant and neglectful attitudes, they assumed all Native Americans to be primitive and violent. The line of native and settler was easier and much more convenient to decipher. White men contended that all whites were, quote, civilized, unquote, while all natives were, quote, uncivilized, end quote. Quote, when you examine at close quarters the colonial context, it is evident that what parcels out the world is to begin with the fact of belonging to or not belonging to a given race, a given species, end quote. It is easier for a human being to dismiss the rights of another human being when its existence is categorized as that of an animal's existence. It alleviates guilt from the individual's psyche and therefore allows him to carry out violent acts without facing the despair of feeling guilty afterwards. For the white man, the native people were a nuisance, a disruption to the perfect order of their social world. They were vermin. Even when reality demonstrated otherwise, their towns were regarded as, quote, hungry towns, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, of light, towns wallowing in their mire, end quote. The native must be humanized. He must assimilate or become useful and beneficial to the white race in some way. He must adhere to the ways of the white man, to belong to civilized society and or be used for the white man's benefit, or be removed from white society. Later, the categorical lines of which to pull one back and or forth are not as clearly revealed. Once the white man became knowledgeable of the Cherokee's civilized ways, they found them inspiring, and some even became intimate with the natives and even joined the Cherokee tribe. Hence, a race of mixed bloods were born. These intersectional beings accepted the ways of both cultures. Some chose to follow Chief John Ross, while others chose to follow Major Ridge, and others just wanted to remain the traditional Cherokee people they were before the arrival of white men. The Cherokee people were socially and politically divided, and their lines were vaguely apparent. But contrary to the ideals of Fannin's decolonization process, generally, they did not resort to violence to protect what belonged to them. However, the mixed bloods did have the, quote, lines of communication set up between the two zones, end quote, that Fannin claimed wouldn't be created between the two compartments, of which created a situation of ease, where without it would create a situation of strain. The Cherokee people are generally a very peaceful people. In fact, their behavior during the Cherokee removal and their relatively successful recovery prompts the implementation of Mahatma Gandhi's theory of Satyagraha. In his work on Satyagraha, within the book Nonviolence in Theory and Practice, Gandhi declares that, quote, Satyagraha can be resorted to in almost any situation. People follow it without being aware of it, end quote. He explains certain aspects of a Satyagraha force that the Cherokee used in their reactions to the oppression and violence they faced from the white man. Quote, a Satyagraha obeys the laws of society intelligently and of his own free will, because he considers it to be his sacred duty to do so, end quote, and, quote, does not inflict pain on the adversary. He does not seek his destruction, end quote, because he believes the means will be inevitably embedded in the end, or in other words, what he gives he will get back. Most of the Cherokee people did not retaliate. They did not meet violence with violence. Quote, he does not vent anger on him, end quote. Many of them tried to flee and hide, but eventually most of them submitted to the will of the white man. They submitted not out of cowardice, as the white man would have it explained, but out of respect for humanity, morale, and the future cultural existence of their people. As Gandhi done so well explaining, the white man believed that, quote, using physical force with courage is far superior to cowardice. At least we would have attempted to act like men. That was the way of our forefathers, end quote. Just as the Cherokee repeated their history with their nonviolent ways, so did the white men with their violent ways. In conclusion, the violence of the Cherokee removal could have been far worse had the Cherokee decided to react violently to the threats and actions of the white men. Because of their nonviolent nature and respect of human equality, they obeyed the white men's demands in hope that they would soon be able to return to peace and eventually gain independence. It is their decision alone that kept the violence to its relative minimum. Had the U.S. government accepted the ways of the Cherokee people and respected their rights as humans, there would have been no need for removal. Even with removal in place, if the government had kept their word and taken care of the Cherokee people's needs during the move out west, thousands of Cherokee lives would have been spared from starvation, illness, and disease.